The gavel slammed down with a thunderous crack, sealing Peter's fate. At just 18, he stood frozen in the courtroom, unable to comprehend the words that had just shattered his world. 20 years without parole. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. As the bailiff led him away, Peter locked eyes with Judge Oliver. The old man's face was a mask of cold contempt, his lips curled in a sneer of disgust. In that moment, Peter saw more than just a man in a black robe. He saw the face of a system that had failed him, a world that had already decided his guilt based on the color of his skin. Peter Blake felt very out of place as he straightened his tie. The scratchy polyester of his stolen suit made him feel even more so. He should have been getting ready for his high school graduation at age 18. He fought for his freedom instead in front of the Greenville County Courthouse. Peter had always felt like he couldn't breathe in the small Georgia town of Greenville, which was full of old houses from the antebellum era and Spanish moss-covered oak trees. The Blakes were one of the few black families in a mostly white neighborhood. They knew how to deal with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle racism that ran through the town's southern kindness. Emily, Peter's mother, sat in the front row of the gallery. She looked tough and worried at the same time. Peter had been raised by her alone since his father died 10 years before. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and keep her son's hopes alive. Now, she could only watch hopelessly as those dreams were on the verge of ending. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Franklin Oliver," the bailiff yelled, filling the hall with sound. The black robes of Judge Oliver blew behind him as he walked in. He was a legend in Greenville at 62 years old, known for giving harsh sentences and having old-fashioned beliefs. He looked around the courtroom with steel-gray eyes, stopping for a moment on Peter before he sat down. "Sit down," he growled, his voice rough from smoking and drinking for years. "We're here for the sentencing of Peter Blake, found guilty of armed robbery and assault. Mr. Blake, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Peter stood up, and his legs were shaking. "Your Honor, I swear I'm innocent. I wasn't anywhere near that convenience store that night. I was at home studying for my calculus final. My mom can." It was over when Judge Oliver told him, "That's enough. You've had your day in court, boy. The jury has spoken." Peter got a chill when the judge used the word boy. That word was full of centuries of racial condescension and reminded Peter that Judge Oliver would never accept him as a man. From the start, the trial was a joke. The public attorney who was in charge of Peter was new to the job and not well prepared or organized. A blurry security camera video and the store clerk's evidence that Peter was the thief, even though the thief was wearing a mask, were the main parts of the prosecution's case. The all-white judges didn't believe Peter's story that he had been studying at home, which was his alibi. People didn't care about his perfect record, his 4.0 GPA, or the fact that he was accepted to Georgia Tech on a full grant. Peter Blake, Judge Oliver's words broke the tense silence in the courtroom. "You stand before this court having been found guilty of serious crimes. Despite your young age, the violence of your actions demands a severe response." Peter tried to scream and say again that he was innocent, but the words wouldn't come out. He could feel how the judge's bias was crushing him and shutting out any chance of justice. "It's clear to me," Judge Oliver said, with a sneer, "that you thought your good grades would protect you from the consequences of your actions. But in this courtroom, we judge a man by his actions, not his grades." Peter saw the irony in what the judge said. The system was biased against him from the start and didn't judge him based on what he did. Instead, it rated him based on the color of his skin. "Because of this, I sentence you to 20 years in state prison without the chance of parole." The gavel hit the floor with a loud crash, sealing Peter's fate. There were a lot of gasps and murmurs in the audience. Peter was speechless as he tried to make sense of the words that had just destroyed his world. Emily's scream of pain, "No, Abby," cut through the noise. The sheriff stopped her as she ran forward. As Peter started to understand what the sentence really meant, he felt angry and hopeless. 20 years, his youth gone in the blink of an eye. All because of an act he didn't commit and a system that saw him as guilty from the moment he was born. He never went to college, got a job, or had his own family. The bailiff came up to them with handcuffs ready. The young men looked at Judge Oliver as he turned Peter round to handcuff him. The cold disdain on the old man's face, and the happiness in his eyes, made Peter sick to his stomach. At that moment, Peter saw more than just a man in a black robe. He saw the face of a system that had let him down. A world that told him he was guilty just because of the color of his skin. He felt like he had been hit in the gut when he realized that this was what it was like to be black in America, and that he couldn't afford to be innocent. Peter could hear his mother crying behind him as the officer led him away. He wanted to turn to look at her and comfort her, but he knew that any sudden movement would be taken the wrong way. He didn't want Judge Oliver to get pleasure from seeing him break, so he walked back with his head held high. As Peter left the courtroom, the last thing he saw was Judge Oliver's face, which still had that smug, head-high look on it. Peter made a quiet promise to himself at that moment. He would get through this. He would prove his innocence, and one day he would find a way to make Judge Oliver face the truth about what he had done. The heavy doors slammed shut, making a sound like a grave. Peter Blake was an honor student who loved to dream. He was gone. Inmate 4587 stood in his place, facing a future he had never imagined, and a fight for justice that was just getting started. Peter woke up from a fitful sleep when the harsh electric lights flickered to life. He forgot where he was for a moment because he thought he saw the pictures from his childhood bedroom. The only thing he could see was the cold, gray walls of his jail cell. The events of the last few weeks hit him like a freight train as they came flooding back. After Judge Oliver's gavel fell, Peter's future was shattered. It had been 23 days since he hugged his mother goodbye, with both of them trying to be strong for the other. He had been trying to find his way in a world he had only seen in movies and fears. Peter swung his legs over the side of his narrow bunk while his cellmate, Pops, a scruffy man in his 50s, grunted, "Welcome to the day. Rise and shine, college boy," Pop said, tobacco use making his voice rough. Time for another exciting day in paradise. Peter could barely muster a smile. From the very beginning, Pops took him under his wing and taught him the ropes while keeping the more dangerous prisoners away. Peter wasn't sure he would have made it through his first week without him. Peter could feel the sadness building up in his heart as they walked to the cafeteria for breakfast. He kept thinking about where he was and how long he would be there, as he heard the metal doors clang, the guards yell, and the prisoners shuffle around in the same jumpsuits. Pops told them, "You gotta snap out of it, kid," as they sat down with their trays of weird food. "I've seen that look before. It's the look of a man who's about to give up." Peter poked at his food, but he didn't feel like eating. "How am I supposed to not give up, Pops? I'm innocent, but I'm going to spend the next 20 years in this place. My life is over before it even started." His voice dropped to a whisper as Pops leaned in close. "Listen to me, Peter. Your life ain't over unless you decide it is. You got two choices in here. You can let this place break you, or you can use it." "Use it?" Peter asked, his words showing that he didn't understand. "That's right," added Pops. "You think time stops just 'cause you're in here? It don't. The world keeps spinning, and you gotta keep growing with it. You're a smart kid, too smart to waste away in here." Peter kept thinking about Pops's words. "Use it," as they finished breakfast and went to do their work in the laundry. However, the answer came later that same day in the form of a flyer on the board outside the jail library. The flyer said, "Earn your degree behind bars, promoting the prison's education program." Peter looked at the flyer and felt a little hope start to grow in his heart. He could use his time in this way, for the first time since he was sentenced. This might have been his plan to be more than just an ex-con when he finally got out. Peter made up his mind that night as he lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't going to let this place break him, or let Judge Oliver win. He was going to use every second of these 20 years to get better, learn, and grow. He would use what he learned to fight for other people who had been wronged by the system. When he got out, Peter was the first person in line at the school office the next morning, and he signed up for all the classes he could. He felt like he had a mission again after being freed from jail. As he walked away with his new course schedule, as the weeks changed into months, Peter threw himself into his studies with such a full force that he surprised himself. He spent his breaks at work and during meals reading books about law, sociology, and criminal justice in the library. People noticed how hard he worked. Peter caught the attention of Mr. Thompson, the old librarian who ran the education program. When Peter turned in a stack of books one day, Mr. Thompson said, "You make me think of myself when I was your age. Hungry for knowledge, determined to make something of yourself, despite the circumstances." Peter looked up, interested. "You were in prison too?" Mr. Thompson laughed and shook his head. "No, but I grew up in a neighborhood where most young men my age ended up here. I was lucky enough to have a mentor who showed me another path. Now, I try to do the same for others." As time went on, Mr. Thompson was more to Peter than just a library. He was a friend, a guide, and sometimes a much-needed father figure. Peter's desire to learn and his drive to use what he learned to change the system that had hurt him grew as he learned from him. Peter stood in his cell at the end of his first year in prison and looked at the calendar he had made to keep track of the days. He had marked off 365 days, leaving 6,870 to go. It was a scary number, but Peter felt hope for the first time since he was sentenced. He had lost his freedom, but not who he was. He got closer to being the man he was meant to be with each book he read in class he aced. That man would be able to fight unfairness for himself and other people like him. As he crossed off another day on his calendar, Peter made a promise to himself: "I will not be broken. I will rise above this. One day, I will make things right." For years, he kept this promise to himself every day. "I will not be broken. I will rise above this. One day, I will make things right." He said these words to himself every morning before he got up, and every night before he went to sleep. They kept him going through the long days and even longer nights. As the pages of the calendar turned, showing how much time had passed, Peter's change was truly amazing. The scared 18-year-old boy who came to Greenville State Penitentiary was slowly, but surely, growing up to be a man with substance, knowledge, and a point in life. Peter got his bachelor's degree in criminal justice through a partnership between the prison and the nearby community college. He did this 5 years into his term. It was a sad moment when his mother and Mr. Thompson watched his graduation ceremony from the visitors area. It was a big accomplishment, but it also made him think of the graduation he should have had and the life he should have been enjoying. "I'm so proud of you, baby," Emily told him, as she gave him a tight hug. "You're making something good out of this terrible situation." Peter just nodded, unable to express the complicated mix of feelings that were raging inside him. Pride in what he had accomplished, but also deep-seated anger at the unfairness that had brought him here, and a fierce determination to use his education to fight that injustice. Peter started to think about the jail system in a different way as he studied more. He saw patterns in the lives of his fellow prisoners. Like him, many of them were young black men who had been let down by a biased system. The prison industrial complex was made up of many social, economic, and racial forces that he began to understand. Peter's newfound knowledge didn't just help him do better in school. It also changed how he dealt with other people. He started to set up study groups where other prisoners could get help studying for GED tests or college work. His cell turned into a place where people learned and talked Men who had never thought about college before started reading books and arguing about law and social justice. Pops told me one day, with pride in his voice, "You're making waves, college boy." Peter nodded, aware of the fine line he was trying to walk. Guards are starting to notice. Some of them don't like it when we start thinking for ourselves. He always made sure to follow the rules because he knew that even a small mistake could ruin everything he was working for. But he also wouldn't give up on his goal to teach and empower his fellow prisoners. While the years went by, Peter's notoriety grew. Others in the prison went to him for help and advice, not just with their studies, but also with law issues. Peter wasn't a lawyer, but the many books he read about criminal law made him helpful for many people who couldn't afford a lawyer. Someone new came into the prison about 12 years into Peter's term, and they had a huge effect on his life. Martin Wilson had been a civil rights lawyer before he was found guilty of fraud. Even though he had fallen from glory, Martin still knew a lot about the law and cared just as much about justice as Peter did. One day, Martin told Peter, "You've got a real gift." They were reading a legal brief together. "Have you ever considered becoming a lawyer yourself?" Peter laughed very hard. "Kind of hard to do that from in here. And who's going to hire an ex-con as a lawyer?" Martin looked at him straight on. "There are programs out there, organizations that help people like you, wrongfully convicted individuals who want to enter the legal profession. It's not easy, but it's not impossible either." Peter's thoughts were sown by those words. That seed would grow and thrive over the years to come. With a clear goal in mind, he threw himself back into his law studies with all new energy. He was going to become a lawyer and spend the rest of his life helping people who had been harmed by the system like he had been. Peter studied a lot, had tutors, and made plans for the future during the last few years of his sentence. After getting his master's degree in criminal justice, he started getting ready for the Lest. He was building ties with groups that worked with ex-offenders when he wasn't deep in books. This prepared him for his return to society. During the whole thing, Peter never forgot why he was there. The way Judge Oliver's face turned red with anger as he gave that unfair sentence would always stick in his mind. But where that picture had made Peter feel powerless and angry before, it now made him cool and determined. He would show that judge to be wrong, and not just for himself. He would do it for everyone else who had been wrongly judged because of the color of their skin. Peter was both excited and nervous as the day he was supposed to be freed got closer. He was 38 years old and had been locked up more of his life than he had been free. In the 20 years he had been locked up, the outside world had changed a lot. How would he get around in this strange place? What would people think of a man who had spent all of his adult life in prison? Peter sat on his bed on his last night in Greenville State Penitentiary and looked around the cell that had been his home for 20 years. Awards for good work, academic honors, and letters of recommendation from his teachers and prison staff were all over the walls. Each piece of paper was a step on the long path he had taken, showing that he would not let his problems break him. Pops, who was in his 70s and used a cane to get around, slowly made his way to Peter's bunk. "You did it, kid," he told her in a broken voice. "You beat this place. It didn't break you." The old man had been like a father to Peter for 20 years. Peter stood up and hugged him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Pops," he stated. "You showed me how to survive in here." Pops turned his head away. "Nah, you did more than survive. You thrived, and tomorrow, you're going to walk out of here a free man. Don't you ever look back." As the first light of dawn came in through his cell's small window, Peter gathered the few things he would need for his new life. These included his school records, a few letters from his mother, and a small notebook with his future plans. Things from the life he was leaving behind, like the jail uniform, the worn-out shoes, and the scratchy blankets, would stay behind. Peter got cold chills when he heard the cell door open for the last time. He had been working toward this moment for 20 years. As he walked down the hallway, past the cells of the men he had lived with for 20 years, he heard calls of support and praise. "Make us proud, Peter. Don't forget about us when you're a big shot lawyer. Show us what you're made of, college boy." Peter gave each voice a nod, and his heart was racing with a lot of different feelings. These men were like family to him and helped him a lot. It was harder for him to leave them than he thought it would be. Peter took a deep breath as he got to the last security stop. He didn't remember much about the world beyond those doors. He would have to learn how to live his life all over again. He was ready, though. He wasn't broken after 20 years of being wronged. Instead, they made him a tool for change. Peter Blake walked out of Greenville State Penitentiary into the bright sunlight of a new day, with his head held high. He was ready to start the next part of his journey. When Peter walked out of Greenville State Penitentiary, the sunlight seemed so bright and hopeful. But it quickly became too much for him to handle. The outside world was too much for my senses to handle. After 20 years of fluorescent lights and not spending much time outside. On the street, cars sped by, making a lot of noise from their engines. Almost everyone had a smartphone in their hand, which wasn't common when Peter went to jail. The air smelled different, cleaner, and full of smells he had almost forgotten. Evanel was waiting for him. Her hair was streaked with gray, and the lines around her eyes showed that she had been worried and wanting for 20 years. Peter felt like a child again when she saw him, and screamed with joy. She ran up to him and gave him a big hug. She cried out, "My baby," and held him close. "You're finally back home," he said in a whisper. "Mama, I'm home. I'm home." It felt like I was going back in time. On the way back to Greenville, Peter put his face up against the window of his car and took in the view of a world that had changed without him. Strip shops had taken the place of the fields he remembered, and he saw both sleek electric cars and gas guzzlers on the road. He said to himself, more than to his mother, "Everything is so different." She put her hand on his and squeezed it. "It'll take some getting used to," she noted. "But well, figure it out together." Peter thought the house where he grew up was bigger than it really was. It looked like someone had frozen time in his old room. There were posters of retired players still on the walls, and textbooks from classes he never finished were just sitting there gathering dust. Peter felt sad about the life he had lost as he stood in the hallway and thought about it. He pushed it aside, though. Even though he couldn't change the past, he could make plans for the future. The following weeks were a quick crash lesson in how things work today. Peter had to learn how to use a smartphone, find his way around social media, and get used to a world where everything was done online, from job applications to buying food. As he found something new, it made him realize how much time he had lost. Looking for a job turned out to be a very disappointing experience. Even though he had degrees and skills from his time in jail, the box he had to check on job applications to say he had been convicted of a felony seemed to take precedence over everything else. Peter slammed his laptop shut in anger after getting turned down 10 times in a row. He told his mother, "What's the point of all that schooling if no one will give me a chance?" Emily sat next to him on the couch, the worry on her face clear to see. "Don't give up, baby. The right opportunity will come along. You've overcome so much already." Peter said yes, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling that he had just gotten out of one jail and was now in another one built on racism and treating people like they were less important. He was also having trouble getting along with his mother because of the stress. As a way to make up for lost time, Emily often talked to Peter like he was a teenager when he left. Peter, who is now 38 years old and has been independent for 20 years, didn't like her attempts to hug him. "I'm not a child, Mama," he snapped one day when she told him 3 times in a row about a job fair at the community center. "I can handle my own life," Peter told Emily. The hurt look on her face made Peter quickly regret what he had said. "Sorry," he said, in a low voice. Emily's eyes relaxed as she understood. "I know you're just trying to help." It's just, everything's so different. I feel like I don't fit anywhere anymore. Oh, baby, she said, hugging him. You've been so strong for so long. It's okay to struggle sometimes. We'll figure this out together. There was hope when Peter ran into an old friend named Michael Torres. He had been a year behind Peter in high school. He got in touch after seeing a post on social media about Peter's freedom. At first, their reunion at a nearby diner was awkward. Michael, who was now a successful real estate agent with a wife and 2 kids, didn't know how to talk to his old friend, who had been in jail for 20 years. But the years seemed to melt away as they talked. Michael really paid attention as Peter talked about his past, and how hard it was for him to fit back into society. Man, I have no idea what you've been through, Michael said, with a shaky head. But you've done so much, despite everything. That's amazing. Peter felt seen and valued for who he was, not because he had been in jail, for the first time since he got out. As they were eating, Michael hesitated, then said, "Listen, I might know of an opportunity that could be good for you. There's this community outreach program I volunteer with. They work with at-risk youth, trying to keep them out of the system. They're always looking for mentors who can really connect with these kids. Simeon, with your experiences and education, you could make a real difference." Peter got excited. It was the first time he had felt that way since he was freed. He said, "That sounds great. Can you tell me more about it?" Peter asked Michael as he went over the basics of the program. As Michael talked, Peter felt a sense of purpose grow inside him. It's possible that he can use what he's learned to help other people and start making the changes he's always wanted. Peter went to the community center where the program was held. The next day, the coordinator, a kind woman named Karen, was pleased by Peter's skills and his desire to help others. "Your perspective would be invaluable to our program," she stated. "These kids need someone who understands what they're going through, someone who can show them there's a better path." For the first time since he got out of jail, Peter thought that his past could help him instead of hurt him. He put everything he had into the training, just like he had done with his studies in prison. It gave Peter a new sense of purpose to work with the young people in the group. He saw the same anger, fear, and despair in their faces that he had felt as a young man. But he also saw promise. He was determined to keep them from going through what he had. As Peter was finishing up a mentoring session with a group of teens one afternoon, he saw a flyer on the bulletin board at the community center. It was an ad for a town hall meeting where several local politicians and community leaders would talk about changing the criminal justice system. Peter's heart was beating fast as he read the list. He had always dreamed of being a part of events like this. People could hear his story and push for change. Maybe he could even start to change the system that had hurt him and many others. While writing down the facts, Peter became more determined than before. For the first time since he got out of prison, he felt like he was on the right track. He was still trying to figure out where he fit in this new world and dealing with the pain of his past. Over dinner that night, he told his mother about his plans to go to the town hall meeting. Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. With pride in her eyes, she told him, "I'm so proud of you. You're not just rebuilding your own life. You're working to make things better for others. That's true strength." Peter smiled and felt warm all the way through his chest. Even though the road ahead was still long and scary, he was ready for it. After living through 20 years of unfair treatment, he now had the chance to use that to do good. Peter felt excited before going to bed that night in a way he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new problems, but it would also bring new chances. He was ready to face them all and keep going on his path to forgiveness and justice. The town hall meeting was supposed to start at 7 o'clock p.m., but Peter got there an hour early, which made his heart race with excitement and nerves. As he walked into the community center, where he had been teaching at-risk teens for the past few weeks, he felt a sense of purpose that had been building up slowly since he got out of jail. Volunteers were already busy setting up a podium, arranging chairs, and hanging posters calling for changes to the criminal justice system in the main hall. Peter offered to help, and soon he was talking to other people there, telling them about his experiences and listening to theirs. As the hall filled up, Peter sat down near the front with a notepad in his hand, ready to listen to every word of the conversation that was about to start. A local journalist stepped up to the mic to welcome the group of speakers as the moderator. The moderator said, "We're honored to have with us tonight a pillar of our legal community, recently retired Judge Franklin Oliver, who will be sharing his perspectives on the need for reform in our justice system." Peter stopped moving. Blood was running out of his face. Judge Oliver, the man who gave him 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't do. It was shocking to think that the face that had been in his dreams for 20 years was about to walk into the room with him. Peter looked at the old judge walk up to the platform as if he were not awake. Oliver looked a lot older than he did 20 years ago. His once imposing frame was now bent, and all of his hair was white. He looked at the crowd with the same intense, steel-gray eyes that Peter remembered so well. They looked at each other for a moment. Peter saw the judge's face light up with recognition and confusion, but he quickly turned his attention back to his notes. Peter could barely hear the beginning of Oliver's speech, because he was feeling so many different things at once. Part of him wanted to stand up and shout to tell the whole crowd about the judge's past wrongdoings. But another part of him was frozen with a fear he thought he had long since gotten over. He had to force himself to listen, and what he heard shocked him. Judge Oliver was pushing for big changes in the criminal justice system. Changes that might have stopped what happened to Peter all those years ago. Oliver's speech was rough from age, but he was still in charge. As he said, "We must admit that our system is broken." Peter was nodding along as the judge spoke, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Implicit bias, overzealous prosecution, inadequate public defense of these issues have led to countless injustices. It's time for a change. Was this the same man who looked down on him so badly in court 20 years ago? When the question time came up, Peter raised his hand right away, even though he later changed his mind. As soon as the referee pointed to him, everyone in the room looked at him. Peter stood up after taking a deep breath. "Judge Oliver," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, 20 years ago, you sentenced me to prison for a crime I didn't commit. I lost 2 decades of my life because of the very flaws in the system you're talking about tonight. My question is this: what do you say to the people who have already been victims of these injustices? How do we make it right for them?" The room went silent. Judge Oliver looked at Peter with eyes that looked like they knew who he was. The two men looked at each other for a long time, 20 years of history between them. In the end, Oliver spoke, and his voice was heavy with passion. I remember you, Peter Blake, don't you?" He paused, as if he were having trouble speaking. "I'm truly sorry. Your case is one of many that have bothered me. I don't know what to say. I'm here tonight to fight for change because of all the bad things that have happened over the years." Peter was shocked by how sincere the judge's voice sounded. He had thought about this argument a lot over the years, but never liked this, neither with the man who had hurt him so badly saying sorry and apologizing. Following the end of the meeting, Peter went up to the judge. Oliver gave him a wary look, but didn't move away. Peter said, with a voice that surprised him for how calm it was, "I'd like to talk more about what happened and these reforms you're proposing. I think maybe I could help." Oliver gave a slow nod. "I'd like that, Mr. Blake. I think perhaps we have a lot to learn from each other." Peter felt a strange mix of emotions as they swapped contact information. He was angry and resentful, but he also felt a spark of hope, which he hadn't expected. He had hoped that this chance meeting could be the start of something big. Not just for him and Judge Oliver, but also for the broken system that they both wanted to fix. As Peter walked home that night, his mind was full of all the things that could happen. He went to the meeting hoping to make a difference. But he had no idea that it would force him to face his past in such a direct and personal way. But as he thought back on the night's events, he realized that this fight with Judge Oliver might have been just what he needed to make the change he had been hoping for so long. Peter felt a lot of different things in the days after the town hall meeting. He thought he had buried his feelings for Judge Oliver long ago. But the unexpected meeting with him brought them back. As he lay in bed every night, he kept thinking about their short conversation. He was torn between the anger that had been fueling him for so long, and a newfound interest in the guy who had changed the course of his life so dramatically. Peter had to work up the nerve to talk to Judge Oliver for a week. He was shocked at how quickly the older men agreed to meet up. When he did, they chose a calm coffee shop in a not-so-hot part of town, far from the courts and the areas where Peter had many bad memories. The moment Peter opened the coffee shop door, he saw Judge Oliver right away. The big man who used to be there now looked weak and small, hunched over a hot cup of coffee. Peter thought about it for a moment, the weight of their shared past pressing down on him. But he took a big breath, stood up straight, and walked over to the table. He said, "Judge Oliver," and his voice was more steady than he felt. When the old men looked up, Peter couldn't quite tell what was going through his steel-gray eyes. "Mr. Jones," he said, pointing to the empty seat across from him. "Please take a seat." As Peter ordered his coffee, there was a strange pause between them. The judge cleared his throat when the waitress left. He started by saying, "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Given our past, I know it can't be easy." Peter gave a nod, but he still didn't trust himself to talk. He was about to say a lot of things that made him angry and full of questions. But he forced himself to stay cool as the judge spoke. Oliver went on, "I've been following your progress since your release. It's impressive how hard you work on the youth program and for reform. You took a bad situation and turned it into something good." Peter couldn't keep the anger out of his voice as he said, "A situation you put me in." Oliver flinched when the charge was made, but he didn't say he wasn't guilty. "Yes," he said softly, "a choice I've felt bad about for years." Peter was shocked when he heard the truth. He was expecting people to be defensive and maybe even keep criticizing him. The way they showed regret was reassuring. "Why?" Peter asked as he leaned forward. "Why did you do that?" "I was so young. I still had a long way to go." "What made you take all of that away?" "What color is my skin?" Peter's voice was raw with pain, and for a moment he felt like that scared 18-year-old boy up in front of the judge. He closed his eyes and hid his face in shame. When he opened them again, they were full of tears that hadn't been wiped away. He said, "It wasn't that easy, but yes, my biases did play a part. I was a child of my time, and the way I was raised. I saw another young black man going the wrong way, which is what I expected to see. I didn't dig deeper. I didn't question the proof, or the lack of it. I let you down, and I let justice down." Peter was hit hard by how honest the statement was. Judge Oliver had been a monster to him for years, a sign of everything that was wrong with the court system. Of course, the man sitting across from him was only human. He had flaws, felt bad about what he had done, and wanted to be forgiven. "When did you understand you were wrong?" Peter asked, in a voice that was almost a whisper. Oliver let out a heavy sigh. "It wasn't all at once. I woke up slowly over years. Cases like yours kept coming up for me. They were mostly about young women and men of color who were stuck in a system that was set up to hurt them. I began to notice trends and question the decisions I was making. Afterward, new proof in your case showed up about 5 years ago." He could feel his heartbeat faster. "New proof?" The judge said, "Yes. DNA testing that wasn't around when you were on trial. It cleared you completely. The wheels of justice move slowly, especially when people admit they were wrong. That's why I tried to get your case reopened so that your sentence could be overturned." Peter felt a wave of anger wash over him. "You knew. You didn't do anything for 5 years, while you knew I was guilty. Nothing, Oliver said, in a weak voice. I've been fighting to change the system that let this happen, and to have your case looked at again. That's why I'm such a strong supporter of change. It wasn't enough, though, as you said. There is no way to make up for what happened to you. Peter stood up quickly, making a loud noise as his chair hit the floor. He needed to get some air because these revelations were making him feel like he could not breathe. He walked out of the coffee shop without saying a word, ignoring the judge's calls behind him. Peter took deep breaths of the cool air outside as his mind raced. The news that he was innocent, which he had been holding on to for 20 years, should have made him feel better. Instead, it felt like pulling open an old wound again. Why did you waste all those years? A system that was so broken that justice was still hard to find even after the truth came out. He turned around when he heard the coffee shop door open behind him and saw Judge Oliver hobbling out with his cane slung over his shoulder. The old man begged, "Peter, please. I know I shouldn't ask you for anything, but please listen to me." Peter stopped for a moment when he heard the judge's voice. It might have been desperation or real regret. He clenched his teeth and turned to face Oliver. He said, "I can't change the past. I can't get back the years that were taken away from you, but I can work to make the future different. Actually, and change policy and push for real changes. But I need your help. Your story and the things you've been through could be very useful for making things better." Peter laughed very hard. "You need me again." Oliver shook his head very hard. "Don't use me, work with me instead. Your speech matters, and so does your point of view. We could really make a difference if we worked together. We could help keep other people from going through what you did." When the judge spoke, the seriousness in his voice made Peter think. He thought about the young people he worked with and how many of them were in danger of being sucked into the same system that had taken 20 years from his life. Could he really pass up a chance to change that system? Even if it meant working with the man who had hurt him so badly? Peter finally said, "I need some time to think. There's a lot to think about." Oliver nodded, and his face showed that he was relieved. "Of course. You can take as much time as you need, but please think about it. This could be a chance for both of us to make things right too, for all the people who are still hurting because of an unfair system, and for the mistakes I've made in the past." Peter was angry and resentful as he watched the judge slowly make his way back to the coffee shop. But he also felt a spark of hope. It would take a long time and be hard to forget, but maybe this is the first step on that path. Peter understood as he walked home that the choice he had to make was not just about how he felt about Judge Oliver. This was about the man he wanted to become and the difference he wanted to make in the world. Could he use his pain to do something? Could he work with the system that had let him down to make sure it didn't let other people down? Peter knew he had to do a lot of thinking about himself. As the sun went down over Greenville and cast long shadows across the streets, hearing what Judge Oliver had to say had really upset him, but it had also given him new options. Peter felt like he had a real say in his future, and maybe the futures of many others, for the first time in a long time. The way forward wasn't clear. Peter had a lot of trouble sleeping and thinking about himself. During the weeks after his fight with Judge Oliver, Peter was completely shocked by what the judge said. It brought up old hurts and gave him hope for the future at the same time. Peter found comfort in his work with the youth program, where he could use his problems to help other people avoid what had happened to him. While Peter was in one of these mentoring meetings, Karen, who runs the community center, called him out of the blue. "Karen, I hope I'm not bothering Peter," she said, with an excited tone in her voice. "The office of the mayor just called me. They want you and Judge Oliver to be on a task group that works to improve the criminal justice system. It's a big chance to make a difference." Peter could feel his heart beating faster. This was exactly the chance he had been hoping for, a chance to change policy and make real changes. Hey, but working with Judge Oliver? He still felt sick to his stomach at the thought. Karen said, I'm not sure. He paused. My relationship with Judge Oliver is complicated. Karen said in a soft voice. I know, but that's exactly why they want both of you. When you put your ideas together, they could be very powerful. Will you think about it at least? Peter agreed to think about it after a long pause. He knew the world was pushing him toward a choice he had been putting off. As soon as he hung up the phone, it was time for him to face his past for good. Peter was outside of Judge Oliver's simple home in the Greenville suburbs early the next morning. His resolve was wavering as he kept his hand on the button. The door swung open, though, before he could think again. Judge Oliver just stood there, happy and shocked. Peter, he said, with a smile, I wasn't expecting you. Please come in. Peter went with the judge into a messy study and saw that the walls were covered with law books and framed pictures. One picture caught his attention, Oliver as a younger man, smiling happily in his judge's robes. It hurt Peter's heart to see it, because it made him think of all the things he had lost. When Peter turned to face the judge, he said, I heard about the task force. Oliver gave a slow nod. Yes, I got the call yesterday. They knew I would only do it if you agreed. You have to make this choice. Peter was surprised by how sincere the old man's voice sounded. He came here ready to fight, but Oliver's modesty made him give up his weapons. Peter said, I don't know if I can do it. When I look at you, remember that day in court. I can see 20 years of my life going by in a moment. Peter's words made Oliver's shoulders sag. He said in a soft voice, I get it. I can't forgive what I did to you. I will leave the task group if you can't work with me. Your voice is more important than mine. Peter realized something when he heard the judge's tone of failure. This man wasn't the same one who had given him his punishment 20 years before. That Judge Oliver had been cocky and sure of his own rightness. This one felt down because of the mistakes he had made in the past. Tell me something, Peter, he asked, in a deep, low voice. If you could change one thing about that day, based on what you know now, what would it be? Oliver didn't think twice. He said, everything, and his voice broke with feeling. I would look into the evidence more. I would think about my own views. You would be seen for what you are, a young man with promise, not a number or a stereotype. Peter felt something change inside him as the judge talked. He started to feel something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but understanding. Peter said slowly, I can't promise I can work with you, but I'm willing to try. For the sake of the kids I work with and all the others who could end up in jail if we don't fix it. Oliver's face lit up with relief. Thank you, Mike. That's more than I deserve. For the next few months, Peter and Judge Oliver worked together on the task force too. It was hard, during heated fights and times when old grudges came to the surface. Peter wanted to leave more than anything. But there were also times when Peter could see real pain in Oliver's eyes as they talked about cases like his own. Moments when the judge listened to Peter's story and understood how important his point of view was. There were times when they agreed on something. They both wanted things to change. It took more research to show that Judge Oliver was not only the one who had harmed Peter, but also someone who could help him fight for justice. The judge's TIs and power, along with Peter's personal knowledge and drive, made them a strong team. One night, Oliver looked up at Peter with tears in his eyes. As they worked on draft laws to change the way people are sentenced, he told her, his voice full of emotion, I want you to know that working with you for the past few months has been the most important thing I've ever done in my career. I learned more about justice from you than from 40 years on the bench. Peter could feel a lump in his throat. He said, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we're doing this together. I have hope that real change is possible because you are willing to own up to your mistakes and fight for it. Over the course of several weeks and months, Peter's anger and bitterness slowly began to lift. People laughed together over a bad cup of coffee, shook hands when a major piece of legislation was passed. and talked quietly about their goals for the future. It didn't happen all at once. It was almost a year since their first fight in the coffee shop when things took a turn for the worse. The task group had just given the state legislature its final report, which was a long list of changes that would completely change the criminal justice system. They were put into action. Judge Oliver turned to Peter as they stood on the steps of the Capitol building, with reporters and fans all around them. "Without you, none of this would have been possible," he said, and his voice caught. "I know it's not enough to make up for what happened, but I hope it's a start." When Peter really looked at the old judge, he didn't see the person who had given him his punishment for the first time. He saw a man who had admitted his mistakes and worked hard to make things right. Peter made a choice at that moment that even surprised himself. He put out his hand to shake Judge Oliver's. His voice was steady and clear as he said, "It's more than a start. This is the start of a new life for both of us." Peter felt the last of the chains from his past start to fall off as they clasped hands. He wasn't just out of jail. He was also free from the hate and anger that had been locked up inside him for so long. Though Peter still had work to do and fights to fight, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He was standing there with the man who had once been his worst enemy. He had hope for himself, hope for the system they were trying to change, and hope for a future where everyone would be treated fairly. The task force's work came to an end with the handshake on the Capitol steps. It was also the start of a new time for both Peter and Judge Oliver. As they walked down the stairs, reporters and well-wishers were all around them. Peter felt like he had a reason that went beyond his own healing journey. This was meant to make changes that would last and keep others from going through what he did. After that, Peter and Judge Oliver worked together for a while, and became an unlikely but strong team in the fight for criminal justice change. Their story of being wrongfully convicted, growing as a person, and finally making peace became a stirring cry for change. People asked them to talk at conferences, colleges, and even the state legislature. Peter was in high demand as a consultant for a number of groups working on change projects. He was very helpful because he had a unique view, because he had been a victim of the system and was now trying to change it. He worked hard and used what he had been through to show how a broken justice system hurts people. Judge Oliver, on the other hand, used his legal TIs to push for the task force's suggestions to be put into action. He was honest about the mistakes he had made in the past, and used his own story to encourage other judges and lawyers to look at their biases and make a promise to be fair. Peter got a call from Judge Oliver on a sunny morning, almost 2 years after they made up. The judge was very excited as he said, "Peter, I just heard from the governor's office. Next week, they will sign the Comprehensive Justice Reform Act into law. They want both of us to be at the wedding." Peter had a strong feeling. Their work together came to a head with this act, which included many of the suggestions made by their task group. It called for judges and police to get training on how to deal with unconscious bias, more money for public defenders, and a way to look into possible wrongful convictions. "Judge, that's amazing news," Peter said, his voice heavy with thought. "I didn't think I'd live to see today." Oliver said, in a soft voice, "Neither did I, son. And it's all because of you, your strength and love. It has changed more than just the rules. It has changed people's minds and hearts." As Peter hung up the phone, he thought about how far they had come. From a courtroom where one man's bias had changed the course of another man's life, to working together to change the whole system. When the day of the signing came, it was clear and bright. Peter looked at himself in the mirror as he fixed his tie. He looked back and saw that the man's face was no longer angry and sour. Instead, it was full of hope and purpose. Peter and Judge Oliver were happy to stand behind the governor as she signed the bill into law. As everyone in the room cheered, Peter felt a hand on his shoulder. When he turned around to see Judge Oliver, his eyes were wet with tears. The old judge only said, "Thank you," and his voice was hard to hear over the cheers. Peter nodded, so there was no need for words. They both knew that this moment was more than just a political win. It was also a personal win over pain, bias, and the weight of the past. As they mingled with politicians and activists after the ceremony, a young reporter came up to them. "Mr. Blake, Judge Oliver, so many people have been moved by your story. What are you both going to do next?" Peter and Oliver looked at each other and understood each other better than they had in a lifetime. Peter smiled and said, "We're just getting started. This law is a good start, but we still need to do a lot more. We will keep telling our story, fighting for justice, and wanting things to change." "As you said," Judge Oliver replied. "As always, we'll work with communities, especially young people, to make society more fair and just. We learned from our trip together that things can change, even when it seems impossible." Peter was sitting on the steps of the Capitol building by himself as the day came to a close. He thought about that terrible day in court, the long years he had spent in jail, and how angry he had been for so long. Even though it had been a long and painful road to get here, he wouldn't change a thing. In the late evening, Peter was supposed to talk to a group of young people who were in danger at the community center, where he started his work as an advocate. He realized as he was making his notes that his story now had an ending, or rather, a new beginning that he had never thought of. Peter felt the weight of his painful and life-changing events as he stood in front of the group of young people, some of whom looked hopeful and some of whom looked skeptical. Seeing these young people made him remember when he was younger, and he was determined to help them avoid the traps he had been in. Peter began, "I stand before you today not only as someone who has lived through injustice, but as living proof that things can change. That forgiveness can be a powerful force for good. That your past doesn't have to define your future." As Peter talked, he saw familiar figures sneak into the back of the room in silence. Judge Oliver stood there and listened carefully, showing in silence how powerful understanding and peace can be. At the end of his speech, Peter said some things that showed both his path and his hope for the future. "You can make a difference, change your life, and change the world. No matter where you come from, or what bad things happen to you. That's true, and I promise you that if I can do it, so can you." As the room erupted in cheers, Peter looked out at the sea of young faces full of hope and promise. He knew that his real sentence, his real purpose, had just begun. Let me know in the comments section what interests you the most in this story. It takes me lots of time to put this story together for you. Kindly leave a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel and share this video. Also, channel for more stories like this. Let's meet over there.